Well, I had an unfortunate event the other day about 5 miles from my house. Everything died on the Aventon. And I'm not sure what the problem is, but I've traced it down pretty close to the controller. So I did buy another controller, and I'm going to go through the steps to replace this controller as the factory controller. And we will see if that's the problem. I did also buy a display, which I may end up taking back. I'm not sure if that's actually the problem, but it's probably the controller or the display. And I want to get some voltage checks just to see if everything checks out. So, wasn't something I anticipated. I guess I could have been farther from home when it happened, but as it turned out, things could have been a lot worse than they were. And so here we are. Here we are with the old controller and the new controller. When I initially checked into the troubleshooting instructions online, what I found was that the controller wasn't even mentioned. It was make sure the battery connections are tight, and you know, I think that's the kind of thing that most people would check, the obvious stuff, right? Make sure the battery is on, so you have to hold in the button on the battery momentarily and, you know, push it quickly to turn it on, push it longer to turn it off. So the battery was on. I had power from both batteries going into the combiner or the balancer. And there was no power at all to the main display. So I am leaning toward it being this, especially since, I don't know if you see that white stuff, that's called heat paste, and the components within this controller give off a lot of heat, and this aluminum block acts like a heat sink, and it goes up against there. The one thing that I didn't get from Aventon was I did not get more heat paste, so I'm a little disappointed. I'm going to have to try to take that off and rub it on the new, on the new unit, just to make sure that we have a good contact surface on this heat sink. And I did notice that when I took the unit off, I noticed that there are two plugs that look like they could potentially be swapped, but I guess not, because really this is a female and that's a male, so I'm wrong. So there's really only one way that you can hook this up. So we're going to give it a shot. Another thing that they run you through the troubleshooting sequences is loose connections. And I did check all the connections at the handlebar. I checked to see if there were pinches or rub-throughs, and I didn't find anything. So I would have been under warranty if this had failed and I hadn't added the balancer. But since I added the balancer, I had to basically eat $120 for this controller. So I'm hoping that this is not going to be an all-the-time thing. And for what it's worth, I put a lot of miles on this bike with two batteries just as it is. So I don't know why it decided to give up the ghost. It was fairly warm. I say warm. It was 70F. It wasn't extremely warm when it went out. So I don't know. Sometimes these electronic things, they just go out. So we'll give this a try. I'll see what happens, and if that doesn't work, we'll go to something else. So here's what it looks like after I transferred the heat sink paste, which I just kind of took off of the one, added it to the other. I wish there was a little bit more of it, but I think it's enough. As long as we have a strong surface-to-surface contact, we should have good heat conduction there. But that's one step that you don't want to leave out. I noticed something here that is very critical. But when I mounted this to the plate, or I held it up there, you could see daylight through it, which means we did not have a firm contact. When I checked up against the both surfaces, I could see daylight through that. So we were not getting a good conduction through the heat system. And I noticed that I think what the culprit is, if you look, you see that grommet there? Like it's overlapping the edge of the casing some. So that's actually a factory issue that's doing that. And it's actually keeping I believe, keeping a good strong contact from happening. So I'm going to take my razor knife and I'm going to trim off that part of it. So there's the removed. Now you can see that surface level, and here's the little strip that was obstructing right there. So that was a factory issue right there. So could have very easily caused this issue. Also, on the heatsink, there's a little lip that I hope you can see right there. There's a small lip, and it pushes into the grommet. And I actually had to remove some of the grommet because it was actually also keeping that from making a solid connection. It's intended to hold the grommet in, but the grommet's too thick right there. So that just be aware of that if you're changing this. Also be aware that there is a curvature on the heatsink, and there's only 3 screws that hold that controller in place, and the middle screw is going to be is a longer screw. So just keep that in mind. There's 2 short screws and a long screw. Long screw goes in the middle. Just a heads up too, and it's an easy mistake to make, but this is not 10 gauge wire. Let me see what this actually is. This is 14 gauge wire, but it's the same exact plug, you know, that fits these that I've got rigged up here. So I was going to use that, and then I looked a little closer. You can really tell the difference if you look. You know, the 10 gauge is made to carry the 30 amps that you need for a 700 watt, 750 watt motor. This is too small of a gauge, so just double check that. I mean, it'd be much better to wait and buy the right thing than to wire that up, because that's going to have some trouble pulling the current if, you know, when you start pulling a lot of current. So yeah, no using that, and only using the better ones. So there's the completed new controller mounted to the heatsink, and I've got the balancer on here as well. And I know that if you're like me, you tend to jump to conclusions about things, and you think, oh, it's that cheap balancer. But I hope I'm wrong. I hope it was the controller, because, and I'm going to do some voltage testing before I put everything together here. So the chances of that being bad, I guess, are about 50-50. I mean, it could have been bad. And when they do go bad, I don't know what happens. I would think they would just open up, but maybe, you know, something else happens. So I did check. We did have voltage to this. So it's going to be a learning experience for me, and hopefully it'll help you as well. So I have everything plugged in but the second battery. And I wanted to just mention that these little plugs have arrows on them that line up so that you don't get them wrong, because they're like, a lot of them are multi-pin plugs. This has a white painted arrow, but this one, they both have white painted arrows. If you look, you can see, I'm going to try to show you here, that you can line those up. And if you don't line those up, you could be in trouble. But also, some of the plugs take a considerable amount of force to plug back together. So this plug and this plug, you can't be lethargic about plugging them together. You have to use some force to really make sure that they make a good connection and that they plug back in properly. Another precaution that you can take is you can put tape around these yellow plugs, these XT plugs. They're pretty well fastened, but if you want to make sure they don't get pulled apart, I just put an extra layer of tape around those. And now it's time to try to pack all this in there in a neat, orderly way that the wires don't get scrunched, pinched. Just a quick word of advice, but when you're putting this strip in here where the battery cavity is, it holds the wires, and sometimes it takes a little bit of finagling to get that in there correctly. But also there's a screw right here that holds it, and I always put a cloth down in the bottom before I put that screw in, because if you drop that screw without the cloth, it will most likely go down in the cavity and you'll have to disassemble everything you just put together. So just a quick word there. hopefully that'll help. And most people who have these bikes know this, but it's a quick push for on and maybe a 5 to 10 second push to power the battery off. And if you don't do that, of course, the bike will not start. So here is the moment of truth. We're going to find out. I don't have the second battery in yet, but I'm just going to try it with the first battery. Powered it up. Get like a small violet light. And yeah, here goes, man. Let's see. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. Well, apparently that is not the issue, which is unfortunate. In a way, it's good because I have a spare controller. In another way, that means I have to look further. So I'm going to keep looking here, try to see if I can figure out what's going on. Try to plug in the other controller. I already checked these plugs, or the other, not the controller, but try to plug in the other readout that I bought. And I'm glad I bought it now, because that's kind of looking maybe like that could be the problem. So I'll let you know. So the problem was actually the display, which I would have never guessed because we had no power. I would have thought that if the controller was working, even if the display went out, I would still have some kind of power to the wheels, but nope. Lessons learned. It was the display, so I'm going to mount the display where the old one was and keep my spare controller. So here is the second battery installed, and I have the first battery off. So the power that you see there is coming from the secondary battery, and now I'm going to power up the first battery. And yeah, the whole system is working great. I just have to link it up to my phone again, but other than that, man, we're good to go. So a couple of thoughts on this before I do a little wash job on this. You can tell this bike's been around. I think it was beneficial to pull that apart because I found the heat sink issue that existed. Now, whether or not it would have been crucial in the future or not, I'm not sure. And I have two of these bikes, so my wife's bike might be susceptible to the same problem. But the heat sink was not seated well. So it wasn't, certainly was not, the problem was not the controller. So I make the mistakes here so that you can not make the mistakes yourself. So what I would do in a case like this where everything dies is I would check the display first. It's the easiest thing to change. You just unplug this wire here, and then you have the thumb, the little button pad there. And really, if I would have suspected that, I would have done that, but I did not suspect that, so I changed the controller. It's also good news that I have the spare controller here, just in case I ever need a controller, because goodness knows in the future if these will be available or not. Who knows? So I'll have it. I have it on hand. I'll put it in the box, and then that way, if it's ever needed, I'll have it. So I'm going to close this out for now, but yeah. Whenever the power goes completely out, check the display first. Another thing that's really beneficial is having a bike shop that's 10 miles from me that sells these bikes and stocks these parts. And again, I don't know if that'll always be the case, but if you buy a knockoff electric bike, you may not be able to get the part that you're after, whereas I could just show up there and buy the parts. So I think that's one advantage to having something like an Aventon bike.